Welcome to the INSEAD Perspectives, Spotlight on Asia podcast. I'm Samir Hasija, Dean of Asia at INSEAD, the business school for the world. In this series, I have the pleasure of speaking with INSEAD faculty whose research and teaching span a wide range of business disciplines, as well as with leading decision makers from across the region. Together, we explore some of the most pressing issues shaping business and society today, all through the lens of Asia. In this episode, I am joined by my colleague Pushan Dutt, Professor of Economics and Political Science, to discuss the emerging New World Order and what today's shifting geopolitical and economic landscape means for businesses and countries across Asia. So, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Let's start with the obvious and the biggest question in the room. What are the biggest challenges that you see organizations facing in Asia today?
Yeah, so just to give some context, I did my PhD in international trade, and it was a very boring subject. Now, whatever Trump has done, he's actually made international trade great again, okay? So, of course, a big component of the challenges that the businesses are facing is trade. Okay, there are three of them. Okay, one is to do with trade and tariffs, one is to do with investments, and the third one is to do with geopolitics, right? Now, this is particularly acute for Asian businesses because if you just look historically, they have been, trade has been a big driver, attracting investments has been a big driver for some countries like Vietnam, Singapore, etc. And of course, they've always done this geopolitical balance between the US and China, some security ties, stronger security ties with US, for a bunch of them stronger economic ties, especially since the 1990s with China. And now they are essentially, they have to deal with all of these shocks which are coming. Many of the shocks are not predictable, right? Because we had thought, at least in geopolitics, there would be a lot of tension between the US and China, but it seems that the major tension, at least today, is between the US and Europe. So these are the three things that they have to grapple with. But I also want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about AI because that's the big technological change which is coming down the road. The American companies and the Chinese companies are throwing trillions of dollars into investing in AI, right? What is the bet that they're making is that, that soon we will get recursive learning, deep learning, and these things essentially will really accelerate it. What if US and China pull ahead massively, and there's a huge technological gap that builds up between countries in this region, India and US and China, right? This is going to be a problem.
Pushan, I mean, this is very interesting, and goes without saying that this must be on top of the mind of many executives as well as policymakers, business leaders. Everybody, in fact. But let me throw something out there and tell me if I'm thinking about it correctly or not. The world is talking about tariffs, they're talking about geopolitics, but those things are to some extent reversible because it depends on the political swings in the different countries. The bigger challenge, which can have permanent impact, seems to be on this technology front, perhaps less so on the tariff and geopolitical, where it, of course, makes a difference, but perhaps it's reversible. Am I thinking about this correctly or am I off?
Okay, it's a complicated question, right? It's a really big question. It's a great question. So let me first take a stab at the trade front, okay, on the tariff front, right? Whether it's reversible or not, right? So I think in the short run, if you're thinking about your supply chains or if you're thinking about where are you going to outsource or whether you're going to locate a plant here or there, I think the tariffs have not made a big difference. Why? Because essentially, you had the EPA tariffs, which essentially are what I call discriminatory tariffs. So the president comes in and says, you get 50%, you get 20%, you get 10%. Those are illegal now, right? So now what they've done is they've introduced a new kind of tariff, which is a uniform tariff across countries of about 15%, which means that if you are a company, you're going to be faced with a 15% tariff, whether you're in Vietnam or Thailand or India or things like that, right? So therefore, there are no incentives to to shift things around, right? Of course, we don't know what's coming in the future. We can talk about that, okay? So the U.S. president has a lot of degrees of freedom on two dimensions. One is trade policy, and the other one is foreign policy. Otherwise, they're quite restricted in terms of what Congress permits the person to do. So they have options. So the uncertainty hasn't gone away. In fact, I would say that some uncertainty has actually risen. Okay, but on the technology front, I think it is inevitable. People underestimate exponentials. They have to sort of pay attention to that. At the same time, organizations are slow. People have a lot of inertia in them. So therefore, the impact of this can actually take a long time to play out. But there will be shifts. There will be like a gale of creative destruction, and not just like a slight breeze of creative destruction. And I think they have to be ready for that.
Given what we just talked about when it comes to tariffs, technology, and you're making a very good point. If I move away from business and go more to the economy level, this entire movement of geopolitics, tariffs, polarization, what does it mean for ASEAN countries, and in particular big economies in the region like India, Indonesia? Like, how do you see them moving forward, and more importantly, what can they do to make sure that they're on the trajectory that they want to be?
Okay, so let me just step back and just think about what should we think in terms of tariffs and the global trading order going forward. Then we can do deeper dives into India and Indonesia, right? So the first thing I would tell the audience is that you should actually go and read this book called Breakneck, which is by a person called Dan Wang. It's probably going to win the Financial Times Book of the Year. And what Dan does is that he makes a really nice contrast between the US and China. So he says the US is a lawyer society, okay, very litigious, and China is an engineering society. So when he sort of traces, the political leaders, and in China in the past, in the Politburo, there were lots of engineers. In the US, almost every president is a lawyer, right? So what this means that everything gets litigated, and this is what has created uncertainty on the tariff front. So Trump comes in, he imposes what I call EPR tariffs. Okay, so these tariffs are discriminatory. So what he could do, and what he did do, was impose different tariffs on different countries, on different products. He put them on, he brought them back. So he had tremendous degrees of freedom, and he used this in a sense as a coercive tool, right, to sort of buy deals, right? So Vietnam sort of agreed to buy liquefied natural gas. Okay, Malaysia said, all right, if the U.S. puts a firm on an export entity list, okay, let's say a Chinese firm, then we will do the same, right? So they gave up a little bit of their sovereignty and they drove these deals. Now these deals are looking really weird because, maybe there was no need to do all these deals. India, in fact, has stopped negotiating on the deal which was almost concluded. So have the Europeans, right? So what is going to happen with tariffs going forward? Okay, so there are 15% tariffs. These are there for 150 days. Mm-hmm. So what happens when 150 days expire? No one knows. Okay, it's not enough time actually, because it's a litigious society, for these tariffs to be actually sorted out. The last one took about almost a year, right? So what is my prediction? Okay, and I think that is sort of useful for firms in this region to think about. Okay, so there are these things which are called Section 301 tariffs, which are done against particular countries after investigation of unfair trade practices. My prediction is that the Trump administration is going to push that. I'll push along those lines, okay? But it'll be slower because you have to do an investigation. The second tariffs are on national security grounds, which are at the sector level or a product level. So they apply to everyone. So that is actually going to hurt the U.S., right? Because they've been putting it on steel and aluminum. So if you're a U.S. car company, suddenly your costs of goods actually has gone up. And if you're a Japanese car company in Japan, you essentially have a competitive advantage, right? Those are what, in one of my recent posts I called hapless tariffs, right? Where you're hurting yourself and helping the other person, right? There's another deadly one out there, which is called Section 338 tariffs. Okay, this hasn't been raised yet, where the president can again put about 50% tariffs, saying that U.S. is being discriminated against. Very hard to prove, but again, here's the problem: because it takes time, he could impose it. It runs for a year, and everyone gets this thing. Because Trump has always said he's a tariff man. some mix of these is going to come around. So just to summarize, Section 301 slowly over time, okay, nothing to panic about. Section 232 is the hapless tariffs, okay, is a competitive advantage. The one to fear is the last one, which is the Section 338 tariffs. Are they going to come? We sort of don't know, which means uncertainty remains elevated, which in turn, what should you do? Don't do anything, okay? Right? Imagine you woke up on April, Liberation Day tariffs. You looked at, 45, 60% tariffs and said, oh, I'm going to switch my supply chain out of Vietnam and take it to Mexico, right? Terrible idea because, within like a week, these were gone, right? So wait and see.
Right. And coming back to specific economies, so any insights on countries like India, Indonesia, especially in this entire US and China kind of debate going on?
So whenever I teach senior executive audiences, there is a thing that the audience really wants to hear, okay? The thing they really want to hear is that every crisis is an opportunity. Because they love this line. I refuse to say it. Because sometimes a crisis is just a crisis. It's not an opportunity. You need to muddle through it. You need to plan for it. You need to come up with different strategies. But sometimes it's just a crisis. And of course, the problem is that we cannot observe the counterfactual world where the crisis didn't happen, which would probably be a better world, right? Okay, so I think, therefore, it's very important that don't be overly optimistic because that's denial, that's delusion, okay? Be very hard-headed about it. Be very clear-headed about it, okay? So now let's take India and Indonesia, okay? So India was supposed to benefit from the first Trump tariffs, which were against China. Everyone was saying China +1. India is going to benefit massively. India did not, okay? Who benefited? Vietnam did, Thailand did, Mexico did, okay? This time again, when Trump comes into power by November 2024, India is very excited and then gets hit by 50% tariffs, okay? Because, all the hugging between Modi and Trump doesn't pay off dividends, right? So what should India do? India should actually do still the fundamentals, okay? It has to attract investments. It's doing well with global capability centers. The big AI companies are investing, $100 billion in data centers there, right? So do the fundamentals again. Labor market regulations have been changed. It has to be about implementation. Bankruptcy laws have been changed. The GST system has been changed. The big thing that I think that India really needs to do is that because India has taken a bet on the services sector, right? $250 billion IT sector, 5 million people employed. Tiny compared to the rest of India, but still, it's an important part of the growth story, right? Here's what's happening, right? We can see that Claude and Code and Claude Cowork is spinning up these things very, very fast. So companies like Wipro, Infosys are pivoting. They're saying that, okay, we'll help you, integrate AI into your organization. So they have to do that, and they have to do that very, very quickly. Okay. So, but the tragic part is that the companies which are actually investing in these data centers and these might actually be used to replace the very firms which employ millions and millions of workers, right? So therefore, this requires speed, and this is something that India doesn't do really well, right? On Indonesia, the big thing that is there in Indonesia, if I'm thinking about industries of the future, is that it's still a commodities country and it has a lot of nickel, right? So like in 2023, they supplied 37% of global nickel, right? And these goes into electric vehicles. Now, they want the entire supply chain, right? They don't want to be the upstream guys just taking nickel supplier, right? And they're saying this to the U.S. They're saying this to the Chinese firms, and that's a good thing, right? Because otherwise you run into the same problem as like Venezuela, where over reliance on a particular natural resource leads to a natural resource curse. It leads to this Dutch disease problem where it kills off your other export sectors. So therefore, Indonesia has to be very serious and again, very quick in terms of moving up these kinds of supply chains. Again, other countries will have different challenges, of course.
But do you think that they are set up to move up the supply chain right now? Do you see a movement in that direction, or do you see that as an intent but no infrastructural investment in logistics, etc., which will help them move up.
Indonesia always has a problem. Both India and Indonesia, they're slow, right? They're slow, they're bureaucratic. This is, being democratic always means that things go slowly, especially if you're in a federal system, etc. But there are advantages to slow democracies. They don't take. Yes, they can't take good decisions quickly, but they can also not take bad decisions quickly, right? I think they're doing okay in infrastructure. Indonesia still has a geography problem. It's an archipelago. Different kind of levels of development in different parts. So challenging, demographic dividend, things like that, right? But I think speed is going to be key, especially the speed at which everything is changing, whether it's AI, whether tariffs coming on and off, whether geopolitical shocks, etc.
All right, thanks for that, Pushan. And one thing that used to always come in my mind, and I want to see whether that's true or not. A lot of people are questioning the whole concept of globalization. They're saying, is globalization still relevant or not? At the same time, people are saying that this is an opportunity for regions, like let's take ASEAN, for example, and Singapore will be hosting ASEAN in 2027, I think. But that for them to create more closer economic ties, almost like becoming the Eastern version of EU, so to speak, to the extent possible. Do you see this as an opportunity for certain economies to come together and use their sort of relative competitive advantages put together in a way that then competes and creates a new kind of pole in the multipolar world? Or do you see that it's okay, it's not heading in that direction, it's just they're just cooperating more, but this is not going to create a new pole?
Let me sort of speculate on the future of the global trading order, and the ASEAN component is going to be one of them. So I think there are three scenarios. Okay, one is reversion, right? So the Democrats win the midterm elections, they take control of the House, maybe of the Senate, though that's a low probability event, and then they essentially put sand in the works and clip Trump's degrees of freedom, right? And maybe the next president is a Democratic president, right? So we get to this first scenario, which is reversion, right? In that case, if you're a business, you go back to business as usual. You think about price, you think about quality, you think about growth, the usual stuff that we teach, that we used to teach. Okay. The second scenario, I think, is a scenario called incoherence. Okay, and I think that's the most likely scenario. So even if there is a reversion, right? If I am Singapore, if I am Vietnam, if I am the European Union, I'm going to say, well, I cannot let my country's policies be determined by what 40,000 voters in Wisconsin think about the price of eggs every 4 years. That's not a way to run my policy. So therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy insurance, right? So I'm going to strike lots of different trade deals. If I have a trade deal, I'm going to deepen it and things like that, right? So there the WTO will sort of limp along, okay? But there'll be lots and lots of different trade deals there. Local content requirements, okay, anti-dumping provisions, data regulations and things like that. This is actually a tough world for companies, right? Why is it a tough world? Okay, so supposing you're importing something, right? You have to figure out what is the component coming from different countries in whatever you're importing or whatever you're pushing out, right? And that becomes really, really hard. So they'll have to invest massively in compliance, in data, in understanding regulations, and most importantly, in lobbying. So it's going to get a lot more complicated. The third scenario, okay, which is the scenario which I fear, even though it's a low probability scenario, is a collapse where the WTO just fades away. Trade is no longer about efficiency. Global supply chains are no longer about efficiency. It's all about, nationalism, making sure that there aren't any chokeholds, choke points in my supply chains. It's about self-sufficiency. So it's no longer about trade. So I fear the latter. Okay, I'm skeptical that of the first one. I think the middle option where we sort of muddle along is going to be the most likely one, but it's going to be expensive for firms. So firms should actually get ready for the incoherent scenario today.
And you don't see a free trade environment in certain select countries, a bigger group than what we've seen in the past, which will allow for the second scenario with more ease of mind and ease of doing business?
So we are seeing a proliferation of these trading agreements, right? So just look at the European Union. They signed one with Mercosur, the set of Latin American countries. They signed one with India. India signed one with Switzerland, Liechtenstein,
Right.
and a bunch of these guys. You know, Singapore, New Zealand, UAE, signed one, right? So plurilateral arrangements. If you ask trade economists, what's the best way to organize trade? Okay, is to do it under the WTO. Okay,
Right.
not have this like noodles bowl of trading arrangements, because it just creates
It's
massive
confusing. Yeah.
compliance costs, and it leads to something which is called trade diversion. You're not trading with the most efficient trading partner, okay, which you would do if it was all WTO rules. You are doing it because you have some preferential access, right? So there are actually efficiency losses there.
All right. I mean, it's fascinating, and certainly the last scenario you painted was very dystopian. So I hope that is not the case. I do get a sense that many of the executives we talk to think about incoherence, is what you called it, as the likely one too. There seems to be some recognition there. At the same time, that leads to a lot of burden on their operations and their strategic vision of how to navigate this going forward. So, in particular, in Asia, what advice would you give to leaders to deal with all these uncertainties that we've talked about? I mean, it's a plethora of them. I mean, it's very hard for me to even list the ones that you've talked about in just the last 20 minutes. So, but how would you advise them to navigate all of this?
So how should firms think about it? How should senior executives think about it? Okay, so the way I do it in my conversation dialogue classes with senior executives, the big distinction that I've started making is this distinction between risks and uncertainty. Right? It's an old concept from it's a so there's a concept of Knightian uncertainty. It's easier to understand it in Donald Rumsfeld's terms, right? He of the Iraq War, which is that risk is about known unknowns. I can put a probability distribution around it, and uncertainty is about unknown unknowns. Most of the people, they know how to handle risk. They do it on a daily basis, right? Whether you diversify, you use your supply chains and things like that, right? Under uncertainty, you have to think very differently. Okay, so under uncertainty, what is some of the things are actually counterintuitive, right? And when you making decisions under uncertainty, just to give you a concrete example, one of the best things to do is to do nothing. Okay, which is what we were talking about when the Liberation Day tariffs come in, right? Because you want to wait for the uncertainty to resolve itself. So waiting is valuable, right? Your standard NPV positive rules no longer apply, right? There's a long literature in economics where which is about thinking through real options, right? So real options essentially is the analog of financial options. Financial options is the right but not the obligation to buy or sell a security. This is the right but not the obligation to make decisions, real decisions. So what does this mean, again, concretely, right? So supposing you are deciding that I'm going to enter a market. Don't enter in one shot. Enter in steps. Stage it. You're deciding to exit a market. Don't leave immediately. Okay, maybe exit in steps. You're deciding to change a supplier, right? No, do it slowly. Don't jump from one supply to the other, right? So this kind of real option lens thinking is I think a useful way of navigating all these uncertainty. Another thing which I would like to say is that we do a lot of strategy, right? But I think now strategy is no longer about here's my 5-year, 10-year blueprint, right? You can write as much strategy as you want. The way to think about strategy is that this is a sequence of if-then statements, okay? It is actually about identifying pivot points, right? If this happens, how do I pivot, right? And then, can you pivot or not? So what do you need in order to pivot? Well, what you really need is slack, okay? What does slack mean? You need dry powder. You need slack financial resources. Okay, so and these are going to be costly, right? Just holding capital on your books and not deploying them, there's an opportunity cost to it. But most importantly, what senior leaders really need is slack in time, in attention. Okay, if you don't have that, then you can write as much strategy as you want. You're just going to muddle along.
It's very interesting. And I guess what you're saying, Pushan, is also to build a lot of agility in the organization, right? Because yes, there's a real option, but you said it in the way you articulated the message, was that it needs to be something that you can act on. right? And so you've definitely got to build agility and dry powder to be able to act on this. Um, it's funny. I mean, back in the day in operations, which is my field, we used to talk about this concept of just in time. What you're telling me is what is more important is just in case. And so we have to abandon the just in time and think about the just in case.
Yeah, and it's also very important to realize that pivoting from just in time to just in case is going to be expensive for you. If you do not recognize those trade-offs, if you do not recognize the expense and you merely, whistle into the future saying this is an opportunity in this crisis, then you are again, indulging in a little bit of delusion.
Do you think in Asia, our markets give leaders or are beginning to get sophisticated enough to give leaders the space to actually make these kind of expensive investments? Do you think the markets have wisened up to this, or are the markets still holding them to some myopic performance criteria?
So, a lot of the firms in this part of the region are sort of family-owned businesses, right? And therefore, they at least have a longer-term vision, longer-term outlook. Not like quarter to quarter. The stock market holding your feet to the fire, and your shareholders holding your feet to the fire. At the same time, as an economist, I think there is something really good about the shareholder model. So I would not sort of completely push it aside. And this is the same thing that we spoke about democracy, right? Yes, you can have a family-owned business where you have a lot of discretion in making decisions, but you can also have a lot of discretion in making bad decisions, right? So the question is then, how do you sort of balance it, right? And just to give you a concrete example, if you look at whoever are the big companies today, right? Your Google, Meta, Facebook, etc., right? So they all started off as, an entrepreneur model, but they never became family business models. Like Jeff Bezos left, Bill Gates left, and these are still very, very powerful. These are the most powerful companies in the world today, right? Because they are run by really good management teams, right? Not true for most Asian companies. If I look at Japan today, right? What do you see? The Japanese stock market is doing really well. Why is it doing well? Because they're moving the corporate governance system more towards the US model, right? So it's no longer about lifetime employment, no longer having zombie divisions hanging out, no longer about developing every technology inside the company instead of just buying it off the shelf. So there's something good about the US shareholder model as well.
Very interesting. And if I circle back to this idea of technology and AI that you talked about right in the beginning, and link it back to this whole real options and agility and thinking carefully about what you need to do to tackle uncertainty. Do you think that while Asia does not have a technology advantage and it is facing a pretty serious challenge, rather than focusing on technology as a means to increase productivity, if they start pivoting their mindset on technology as a way to increase their agility, they can use the same emerging technology, which is not something that they are accelerating as fast as, let's say, the US is, but still use it to their advantage to navigate the world going forward. Do you think that is something that they should think carefully about?
No, I think it's very hard to predict anything in this space, right? So I have very little confidence in what I say, okay, because things are changing so rapidly. So, but at least this follows almost like an axiom. If things are changing really, really rapidly, you need the ability to adapt quickly, which is you need agility, right? Okay, how are you going to do this? Okay, are there some lessons from history in this? Okay, so because this is not the first big technology which has come along, right? The last big technology which came along was the internet, right? Late 80s, early 90s. I think AI is still like a very different in terms of acceleration. But now, what happened during the internet is that we saw the emergence of these big IT companies, and they were all American, right? Okay, so and this time, China is trying to make sure that they sort of dominate, right? So what was the mistake that, let's say, the Asian companies did or the Europeans did? Why, the Europeans and the Asians always ask themselves, where's our Google, where's our Microsoft, right? What they really did incorrectly is they did not invest in technology enough, There's a lot of research essentially showing that there are two things that they really struggle with. One is the difference investments in technology explains about half the productivity difference between American and European firms. There's no study of Asian versus American firms. The second is that the American firms are just better at management. Okay, they're better at managing people. What does that mean? They hire talent. Okay, they promote outperformers. And most importantly, they fire underperformers. The Europeans can't do the latter, the last one, okay? Partly due to the choices that they've made, partly due to labor market regulations. So what does this mean, again, for AI? What should firms be doing? They should actually be investing in, cloud computing. They should be investing in digitizing their data. They should be doing concrete things. I've done a comparison of like European banks versus American banks. The way that they're approaching AI is like, heaven and earth. It's completely different. One of them has a chatbot, okay? And one of them is building an entire tech stack inside because you can't, put your financial data into ChatGPT and say, give me insights, right? They're hiring more AI engineers than they're hiring financial analysts, right? So I can see the same thing getting played out, at least between US and Europe, right? So the thing that all firms have to do, especially once in this region, is get a sense of urgency.
Yeah. And Pushan, it goes back, and thanks for sharing that, because again, the way I hear you, the message, despite the fact that there are these multiple challenges, still goes back to the same core. You need to differentiate between risk and uncertainty. You need to understand that following the flavor of the month is not going to be the solution. You're going to need to invest in building Slack, building your tech stack, building your agility, so that you can navigate this uncertainty. And so whether it starts with geopolitics or tariffs or the technology war, the principles still are I'm not saying it's an easy problem to solve, but the principles are still the same grounded principles that leaders need to think about and think about very carefully. Easier said than done, but that's one of the core messages I'm getting, and that's quite interesting.
Absolutely, except that the difference is that with all this uncertainty, the urgency has gone up, okay, and so it has to be done faster, and the risk-taking appetite has to go up as well, right? Yeah. Business as usual is not going to cut it.
Yeah, and one of the things we find in our executive classrooms, Pushan, is when leaders from many organizations come here, and we have these conversations with them, it's actually quite rewarding for them to also talk to each other, to not only understand the mindsets that they are all going through, but also have a common sense of urgency and the need to find those solutions. So I can completely, just from my own experience, see where you're coming from, and putting them all together actually also really helps.
Absolutely. So yesterday I was teaching in this advanced management program, which is sort of like our flagship program, right? And we were discussing labor market regulations in Europe, right? And one of the points that I was making is that actually there's no one European labor market regulation. They're very different. So they can learn from each other, and that I think is like very important, not just for countries, but for these senior executives as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Pushan, listen, thanks a lot for taking the time out and talking to us.
Thanks for having me.